This is it. It's ska.
Ska.
Hunter's never heard of ska. I don't know if you out there have ever heard of it. This is a byproduct of like the emerging Christian music scene and the diversity that was beginning to come on the scene in the 90s, the late 90s.
So this is somehow Christian?
Oh, this is a total Christian band. It's called the W's.
Okay.
And they're a ska band,
Okay.
which that's what that's that style.
Okay.
And the chorus line to this song fits with our topic today. I'm going to let it lead up to it because this is a song about the devil.
Good.
You all the devil and the devil is bad. You all the devil and the devil is bad. You all the devil and the devil is bad. You all the devil and you are bad.
You are the devil and
The devil is bad. Well, that concludes our second look today. That's all we need to cover. There's nothing more to say about the devil and his schemes than that.
Like, learning music from you is like going on a journey.
It is.
You just never know.
There's so many things that
So
I have to...
basically, that's like 20s swing music of some...
Yeah, that's exactly right. They brought it back and they added, some modern twists to it. And there's actually there's secular versions of ska as well. I mean,
Sure.
like it was a secular branch of music, and there was just sort of like, oh, now we'll do Christian ska. That's
There's
'cause
Christianized everything.
Yeah, that's
There's
what we did.
Christian
That's what
Beanie Babies, probably.
No, I'm sure there are. They might be worth something. All right, so we're still in Matthew. If you're hanging with us and tracking with us, something happens in Jesus' teaching towards the end of Matthew 12 where he hits on the unclean spirits, which is why we talked about Satan, because he's right along there with unclean spirits, demonic activity, which has been sort of like an underlying reality in Matthew. Like, there's not a lot of introduction to be like, so there's this thing where satanic, spirits possess you.
There are demons.
And there was no introduction to that. So I just thought that given the fact that this has happened multiple times, Jesus has cast out demons. Now he's talking about spiritual activity. It was worth having a conversation about that particularly. But there's two pieces to this. I'll just read it and you'll hear the two movements and we'll talk about how maybe I connected those dots a little bit. I don't know if I did well on that or not. But here we go. Well, Hunter, why don't you read it? Can you do it? Matthew 12, verse 43. You read it so well yesterday.
I read it last time. So.
Yeah, 43 through 50.
All right. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came, and when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that person is worse than the first. So also will it be with this evil generation. While he was still speaking, while he was still speaking to the people,
there you go.
Behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother.
All right, so this is a series on the teachings and commands of Jesus. And like when it comes to teaching and commands, they're more implied than outright specific is this idea that like there is a spiritual world that is evil and not of God. I would say, biblically speaking, that connects dots to Satan, who is Lucifer, cast out of heaven. He's the deceiver, the one who speaks lies, causes us to mistrust God. He's on the scene in Genesis 3. There are conversations throughout the Old Testament. You can find it in Isaiah, in Job, and all the way to Revelation. This sort of a central figure, if you want to put it that way. He's involved from the beginning to the end as an adversary. And Jesus is speaking sort of like spiritual activity. So like tossing it your way for thoughts out of your own head, like what are the common questions you get on sort of like demonic or have you even gotten any? Like what?
No, yeah.
Like
I
what-
think we all have questions, and I think like on the basic level, we all want to know, how prevalent is he in the sense of like, does he show up in my life, and like, what could I attribute to the devil versus to myself or to my burrito? Like, was that Satan or
If
was
the burritos
that...
came from a popular chain called Diablo's, then probably it was of the devil.
It's really tricky. No one really knows at that point.
There is a chain called
Really?
Diablo. Yeah.
Here in Greenville?
Yeah, my mom loves that place,
Oh my
which is funny.
Well, it might, yeah,
I
definitely
love
from...
Diablo's.
Really? You really
Way to
love-
go, Mom.
But I think that's a big question. Like, how prevalent is he in our lives? And then two, that just kind of asks another question. You brought it up yesterday of, can I be possessed as a Christian? Can he come and ruin my life? That kind of
Yes.
a...
Yeah, and I mean, like, before we go any further, my belief would be like, well, there is a very strong case for Christians being possessed by God
Oh, yeah.
because of the work of Christ and the gospel, and not a strong case by any means for a Christian to be possessed by the devil.
Yeah.
So, like, the evidence, it would be overwhelming towards, like, if we're possessed by anything, it is by God's love. That's guaranteed not to be removed out of our life. In Romans is the conversation. I can't remember. I should have had that handy. But like, nothing is going to like remove us from God's love. Neither height nor depth, the principalities, powers, no matter what it is. So
Yeah.
like we're secure on that level. And I don't think that this idea, like especially like the Hollywood version of like being possessed. I'm not saying that kind of stuff isn't possible.
Sure.
Because I do think that there are solid Christian men and women who have engaged in spiritual combat, if so to speak, where some of that stuff has been real. But like that would be such an odd potential thing. It does not seem to be like a normal thing. What does seem to be the normal thing is that the possibility of Satan whispering doubt and condemnation and sort of like being an advocate of shame and guilt to get you out of this place where you might be resting in God's love for you or enjoying God's love for you. That's the much more likely scenario for the believer.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about like the Spirit himself indwelling us. So you have things like Psalm 139. You can't even make your bed in the grave without the Spirit being with you, in you. You don't get that same presence from a Christian with the devil. Like he's not always with you. He's not always in you.
Right.
Like the Spirit is. So I mean, yeah, you have some, you never want to say never in one sense, right? Like, because God can do whatever he wants, but he must do what he says he'll do. But so like I've even heard of Christians engaging in spiritual warfare and it actually affecting them in some physical way. So like there can be physical manifestations to some spiritual darkness, okay, but in the same way I think we can say in no way does the devil or even his demons possess a Christian in the same way that the Spirit possesses us, or that we are possessed in the Spirit.
Sure.
It's like there's not the same type
Right.
of filling.
And I think what it would be helpful is to sort of like have a practice of saying like, okay, there is a spiritual world and there's a positive force and a negative force. We'll call it the force.
The force.
Maybe there's a dark side
Right.
to the force and a light.
And you have to choose.
But the mini-chlorians is what, sorry.
Choose.
That's my Star Wars relevance that derailed us right there. But yeah, no, we can take that into account. But more than sort of like letting the devil be a scapegoat, blaming everything on him, I'm an advocate for us taking responsibility and
sure.
saying like, okay, you might be able to trace it back and be like, well, the devil tempted me. Okay. More than likely, you were just tempted because you were tempted.
Sure.
Now, I don't know how much if the devil's really doing the temptation. But you got to take responsibility on that. And what I mean by that is like be willing to confess it to God and to others and to know that God's grace covers whatever sin is going on in our life. And the devil ultimately can't destroy us. He can make a mess.
Yeah.
He can make things ugly, and I think we got to be ready to be willing to say like, oh, I think the devil's trying to make things ugly for me.
Yeah.
And I don't want that. So how do we combat it? And I actually think that's the second half of this idea. Implied in this experience, this exchange. Part 1, Jesus teaches on some spiritual activity, talks about how it can get worse because of sort of like an increased number of influences that would return to a reorganized and tidied up mind and house, so to speak. A lot of metaphor here. In the middle of that conversation, it says, like, while he was still speaking, he gets interrupted because his family wants to talk to him. And his sort of like handling of that circumstance is to point out that, oh, you want to talk about family? Let me tell you what family really is. It's those who belong to God, the Father, those who want to align themselves with the Father's will and do what the Father says. That's true family. And it's almost as if there's this opportunity to understand that, like, what better weapon can we wield against Satan and his effect on our life outside of the gospel? And I don't want to minimize that. Actually, the gospel is the superior weapon.
Yeah.
But if we want a secondary weapon that sort of would be like the scaffolding to help reinforce that gospel message, it's going to be a community of people who are gospel-minded and working with you to follow Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Jesus is setting the precedent for his community, his family, which would be the church, and would be those relationships in the church that we are intentional with. We would call that here at East North Church missional community. And we would say a good question to kind of begin to ask in your group, which is how we need to wrap up asking those kind of questions. Like, how does participation in community help you wage war against temptation? How does being involved in community and sort of like maybe even exploring what does it look like to be involved in community, because you're not only being cared for, you're caring for others. How does the experience of being cared for and caring for others help you do battle against the darkness that may be very personal for you? Like, personal darkness could be like anxiety and depression, or maybe some pet sins that you kind of like fall into, coping sins, like turning to things to make you feel safe or help or rescued from your current moment. Those would be idols. Those would be not Jesus things. How does being involved in community help you in that battle? And I think that would be a good place to go, because I think what's being described in the passage is a common experience. We have some kind of like conflict with spiritual temptation. We resist the devil, maybe, and he flees. That's James 4.
Yeah.
But man, he's like a prowling lion that is ready to pounce on us. That's 1 Peter 5. And we know what he's up to. He's going to come back with even more weaponry to try to derail us. Yeah. Jesus has given that heads up to us. And since that's the reality, how can community help? Yeah. And I think the more specific we can get with each other, the better we can help engage in this battle. We can be real. So, like, I think our tendency is to like sweep it under the rug and be like, well, I made it through that temptation, therefore I won't really talk about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Just kind of wrapping up as a moment, and I'm putting you on the spot, so it might be hard to think of. But can you think of a sort of like a specific benefit or like experience? I mean, maybe it's even recent for you. Like, how has being part of a body of believers helped in the experience of what would have been a darker?
Yeah. Well, I think what you said yesterday, it hit home with me, and it's so true. And I think it's the way God set it up. I forget exactly how you said it, but I'll put it in like my own words of, we need to hear the gospel on the lips of another. Mm-hmm. And you only get that with community.
That's true.
I need to hear that I am forgiven, that I'm a child of God freely on account of Christ by his grace. And I need to hear that because I can get that. I can get there in my own head, especially after sin, especially in the throes of temptation. Like, I can get there in my head, but it is very difficult to believe it from myself in those moments. What I really need is somebody else to speak those words to me and for me. So, and I think that's part of the way God set it up. Even, Romans 10, faith comes by hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
and
got to come from
hearing
the
of the
outside.
word of Christ, which I think is code for the gospel.
For the gospel,
Right,
right.
yeah.
So it needs to come from the outside in. And yes, can I hear it from myself? I think I can. But I think more importantly, even having somebody else proclaim that right to me, I need that. Because it's only then when I can really process that and hear that without any of the struggles that I have. Somebody else is telling me that. So that's one thing that I've come to just love every Sunday, especially at East North Church. You're always going to hear it preached in the sermon. You're going to have somebody who understands the gospel, not just in doctrine, but in culture, and they're going to come and help you with what you're dealing with. So I can't get enough of that.
Yeah, and may that be the case for you guys as you lead community this week. We're praying for you and hope this has been a helpful recap of what we covered this past Sunday. Thanks for listening.